The night Imogen Pereira poured half a glass of burrowing owl Merlot down the front of my white shirt, she didn't flinch. She didn't say sorry. She set her glass back on the counter with the slow, deliberate calm of someone who had just done exactly what she meant to do, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You should probably take that off before it sets." The kitchen went quiet, not because of the wine. Spills happened. Glasses slipped on laminate countertops in century-old East Van apartments where the floors were never quite level. But Imogen had said it without a trace of embarrassment. She had a faint smile at the corner of her mouth, and both hands wrapped around the stem of her newly emptied glass, watching me like she was waiting to see which version of me would show up. I had been asking myself that same question for 11 months. My name is Jasper Holt. I'm 29. I work in long-range planning for the city of Vancouver, which mostly means I spend my days arguing about setback requirements and transit-oriented development in rooms that smell like old coffee. My apartment is on the second floor of a 1920s character building on Fraser Street, between a Vietnamese bakery and a bicycle repair shop that is never actually open. I moved in 3 years ago because the rent was, by Vancouver standards, almost not horrifying, and because the ceilings were high and the windows faced south. Imogen moved into the unit below mine 11 months ago. I heard her before I met her. The building had good bones and terrible sound insulation, and for the first 2 weeks after she arrived, I lay awake listening to the low hum of what I eventually figured out was a pottery wheel. She worked at night. I worked early. We were, structurally speaking, a terrible match. We met at the mailboxes. She was holding a package too large for the slot, wearing paint-stained overalls and a toque that had seen better days, and she said, without looking up, "Do you know if the super is actually a person or just a concept this building uses to manage expectations?" I told her his name was Gus and that he was real but rarely responsive. She said, "Classic." That was how it started. Not with chemistry or revelation. Just two people in a narrow hallway with bad overhead lighting and one functional mailbox between them. She was 26, taught ceramics at the community center on Knight Street 2 evenings a week, and spent the rest of her time in her apartment with her wheel and her kiln and what she called a backlog of creative debt I've been ignoring since undergrad. I told myself she was just my neighbor. The problem was that she was relentlessly difficult to ignore. She knocked on my door one Sunday in October to ask if I had a Phillips head screwdriver, and when I handed it to her, she said, "You labeled it." I had labeled all my tools. She looked at me like this, explained everything about me. 2 days later, she returned the screwdriver with a small ceramic bowl she'd made, still warm from the kiln, with a piece of masking tape on the bottom that read, "For your collection of labeled things, Jasper's bowl." I still used it every morning for my keys. She noticed things. When I came home from a particularly grim planning commission meeting and sat on the front steps for too long, she appeared at her door with 2 cans of Granville Island Lager and said nothing until I was ready to talk. When I mentioned offhandedly that I was doing a weekend hike on the Baden-Powell Trail, she texted me 2 days later to ask if my knees had survived. She remembered that I took my coffee black and that I had strong feelings about the crosswalk timing on Main Street, and that I thought the proposed rezoning on Kingsway was a missed opportunity. I told myself that didn't mean anything. I had reasons. A year and a half earlier, I had been in something with a woman I worked with at the planning department. It ended quietly but not cleanly, and for 6 months afterward, every Tuesday staff meeting felt like sitting through a deposition. I made a rule after that. No one with proximity. No one I couldn't put distance between if things went sideways. Nobody lived closer to me than Imogen Pereira. That Friday, she had people over. Not a party, just what she called a low-stakes gathering, which in practice meant 7 people in her apartment eating takeout from the Thai place on Kingsway and playing a round of Settlers of Catan that had already gone on for 2 hours by the time I was invited down. Devin, who I worked with at City Hall, had somehow ended up there through a mutual friend of Imogen's named Suki, and Devin texted me at 8:15. "You're missing Imogen," explaining resource scarcity like she's presenting to council. "Get down here." I went. Her apartment was smaller than mine, but felt warmer. She had prints on every wall, mostly her own work, landscapes, and close studies of hands. There were plants in every window and a bookshelf that had given up on any organizational logic, 3 shelves in. The kitchen smelled like lemongrass and the good candles she ordered from a small maker in Victoria. She was at the counter opening a bottle of wine when I came in. She looked up, and there was a half second where her face did something I had trained myself not to analyze. Then she smiled normally and said, "Jasper, you made it. We're in the middle of a resource crisis. Devon has been hoarding wheat." "I have been perfectly clear about the wheat situation," Devon said from the floor. Suki, who was sitting across from him, looked at me and then looked at Imogen and said nothing, which I had come to understand was Suki's way of saying everything. I grabbed a beer from the counter and sat on the edge of the couch. Imogen came around and settled cross-legged on the floor beside the coffee table, close enough that her shoulder occasionally brushed my knee when she leaned forward to move her pieces. I told myself I wasn't tracking the frequency of that contact. I was absolutely tracking the frequency of that contact. She was wearing a worn gray crewneck and dark jeans, her hair in a loose braid that had mostly abandoned its original structure. A smudge of greenish clay on her forearm that she hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered to address. Ceramic dust on her wrist, just below the silver bracelet she always wore. I was aware of these details in the specific way you become aware of things you have spent considerable energy pretending not to see. At some point, the game ended and people spread out, and Devon started a story about a heritage designation dispute that was genuinely funnier than it had any right to be. I was standing near the kitchen island. Imogen came to stand beside me to refill her glass, and when she leaned past me to reach the bottle, her arm crossed in front of me, and for one moment she was close enough that I could smell whatever it was she used in her hair. She straightened and turned slightly, and we were closer than we should have been for 2 people who were just neighbors. "Careful," she said quietly. "Of what?" Her eyes came up to mine. "That thing you're thinking." I reached for a cracker from the board on the counter. "I'm thinking about the Kingsway rezoning." She tilted her head. "No, you're not." Devon coughed once into his fist. Suki picked up her wine glass with the expression of someone watching a documentary she had already seen and knew exactly how it ended. The conversation moved on. It always did. That was the thing about moments like that one. They happened in the margins, in the space between other things, and then the evening continued. And you pretended the margin hadn't shifted. Later, after Suki and Devon and the others had gathered their things, Imogen and I stood in her kitchen. The rain had started outside the way Vancouver rain in November starts, not dramatically, just steadily, like it has always been there and will simply continue to be. She was washing glasses. I was drying them and putting them away in the wrong cabinet, because I didn't know where her glasses lived. "Second shelf," she said, without looking up. I moved the glass. We were close at the sink, shoulders almost touching. She said, "You do that at work too. The thing where you go somewhere else for a second." I focused on the glass in my hand. Do what? Make a decision and then immediately reconsider it. I was thinking about the rezoning. "Jasper." Her voice was different when she said it like that. Not the version she used when she was asking to borrow things or making fun of something I'd said. Quieter. Like she'd found the seam in something. I looked over. She had stopped washing. Water still ran in the sink between us. "We're neighbors," I said. Something flickered across her face, quick and unmistakable. "I know where I sleep," she said, which was not quite the same as what I'd meant, and we both knew it. The faucet kept running. Neither of us moved. Then Devon appeared in the kitchen doorway in his jacket. He'd forgotten his phone on the counter. He grabbed it, looked between us, and said, "I'm going to let you two finish whatever this is," and left with impressive efficiency. Suki appeared a moment after to say goodbye to Imogen, and when she hugged her, she said something quiet that made Imogen laugh, and then she looked at me over Imogen's shoulder with an expression that said, "I have been watching this for months, and you are both exhausting." The door closed. The apartment was suddenly very quiet, except for the rain. Imogen turned back to the sink. I reached past her to set a glass on the drying rack, and as I did, my hand caught the bottom of the bottle she'd set on the counter. Not the whole thing, just enough. Just enough for half a glass of burrowing owl Merlot to arc cleanly across the front of my white button-up. I stood completely still. She went completely still. The wine spread across the cotton, dark and immediate, the way wine does when it has made up its mind. Then Imogen looked at me, at the shirt, at the stain crawling toward my collar, and that smile appeared. Not apologetic, not startled. The smile of someone who was done waiting. "You should probably take that off before it sets," she said. I looked at her and waited for the laugh, the pivot into a joke about dry cleaning, the quick retreat into comfortable neighbor territory. None of it came. Instead, she reached past me and took the dish towel from the oven handle and pressed it against my chest. Not briskly, not the way you help someone clean up a spill. Slowly, with her fingers spread flat. Through the cloth, her hand rested over the left side of my ribcage, right over my heartbeat. Her voice dropped. "That wasn't the bottle," she said. I stood there with the rain at the window, and the candles burned to their last half-inch, and her hand over the exact place where my heart was doing something embarrassing. "That wasn't the bottle," I repeated. No, she didn't move her hand. The towel was still between us. So was 11 months of careful distance. So were 100 small mornings in the hallway, borrowed screwdrivers, text messages about trail conditions, and 2 cans of Granville Island Lager shared on the front steps without explanation. "You did that on purpose," I said. Her chin lifted slightly. "That's what you're focusing on." I liked this shirt. "You have approximately 4 identical shirts. They each have a slightly different emotional weight." She laughed, and it came out unsteady. And something about that steadied me. I should have said something proportionate to the moment. Instead, I said, "You've been doing this for months, haven't you?" She looked up at me. The thing about Imogen was that she never flinched from being seen. She held eye contact the way people hold a difficult posture, not easily, but with full intention. "Would you like a list?" she asked. My throat tightened. "Fine," she said, "because I can see you're not going to stop being an urban planner about this. Because you leave your front door open a crack when you're working from home, and I can hear you on calls, and your voice gets quieter when you're actually worried about something. Because you remembered that my kiln broke in September and asked about it 3 weeks later. Because you leave the good parking spot open at the front when I'm unloading clay, even though you never said that's what you were doing. Because at Devin's birthday thing in the summer, there was a moment on the deck where you looked at me and then looked away. So fast I thought maybe I'd imagined it. And then you did it again. A third time after that." I was quiet. "And," she said, more softly, "because tonight, when I was standing next to you at the counter, you were holding your breath." I dragged a hand across the back of my neck. Standing there in a wine-stained shirt in her kitchen at 11 o'clock on a rainy Friday, no good excuse left in reach. I said, "You're not just my neighbor to me." Her lips parted. It surprised both of us. I hadn't planned to say it that plainly. I kept going, because the only thing worse than saying it would be stopping halfway. "You're the first person I want to tell when something happens." At work, on the trail, in the meeting where they finally approved the cycling infrastructure on Canby Street, I thought about coming home and telling you. "You make this building feel like somewhere I actually live, not just somewhere I sleep between shifts." Imogen went very still then, But, I said. I looked at the towel, still pressed to my chest. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable in your own home. I don't want to be something you have to navigate every time you need to borrow a screwdriver. I don't want to be the reason you start taking the back stairs." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Jasper, do I look like I'm hiding from you?" "You poured wine on me." "I poured wine on you because apparently 11 months of being extremely obvious wasn't cutting through." I said it back to her without thinking. 11 months. She blinked. "We've known each other 11 months. I looked at her. "You've been counting." Something shifted in her expression, softer and more serious at once. "So have you." Her free hand came up and took the towel from between us and dropped it on the counter. The stain on my shirt was already setting, a dark wash across the left side of my chest. She looked at it, then at me. You really should take it off, she said, practically speaking. I reached for the hem of the shirt and pulled it over my head. The cool November air of her apartment hit my skin. She looked at me with no artifice, the way she looked at her work when she was deciding what came next. Direct and unhurried. You've got clay dust on your arm, she said. It's from the railing downstairs. It's from 3 weeks ago, when you walked me back from the SkyTrain and I was carrying the glazed pieces and one shifted and I grabbed your arm. I kept thinking about that, I admitted. So did I, she said. She reached out and touched the side of my forearm with 2 fingers. Then she picked up the towel again and pressed it, damp and light, against the stain on my chest, and we stood there in her kitchen while the rain came down on Fraser Street. Do you still think this is a bad idea? She asked. I think it's a complicated idea. That wasn't the question. I looked down at her, at the clay on her wrist, at the braid that had given up entirely by now, at the careful, steady way she was watching me, not performing patience but actually feeling it. No, I said, I don't think it's bad. Her hand went still over my heart. Then stop planning it and just be here, she said. Just tonight. Don't draft the risks assessment. Don't model the outcomes. Just choose this. Something in me that had been doing paperwork for 11 months finally set down its pen. I raised my hand to her face. She was warm beneath my palm, and I felt the soft exhale of her breath catching. I'm choosing this, I said. She rose up and kissed me. It was quiet and certain. Not a question, but an answer to one we'd both been sitting with too long. I slid my hand to the back of her neck, and she made a sound that undid everything I had been very responsibly holding together, and I kissed her back with 11 months of accumulated honesty. When we broke apart, her forehead was against mine. The rain was louder now, or we were quieter. Okay, she said. I smiled into the space between us. Okay. Her hand was still flat against my bare chest, right over the place where everything had started. Stay, she said. Not like that, she added it quickly, but with the slow smile of someone who knew exactly how it had landed. I have an extra toothbrush. The roads are awful, and I've been working up to this for 11 months, and I don't want you to go upstairs and disappear back into your apartment. Like none of it happened. I said yes. The next morning, I woke up on her couch with a blanket that smelled like her studio, and a cup of coffee already on the table in front of me. Imogen was at her wheel, in the corner of the living room, working with her headphones around her neck and flour on her elbow from something she'd made in the early hours, because that was exactly the kind of person she was. She glanced over. Her hair was already up, clay to her wrists. Morning. You made coffee, I said. You were asleep. She wiped her hands on a rag. How's your chest? I looked down at the faint wine shadow still visible on my skin. The shirt, I said. She grinned. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I think we're past laundry logistics. Are we? She came around and sat on the arm of the couch. I shifted to look up at her. No guests, no Devon, no Suki, no one to soften the fact of this of us, sitting here in the ordinary gray morning. Are you regretting it? She asked. Not even slightly, I said, her shoulders eased. Are you? I asked. She looked at me with something that was almost exasperation, but warmer. Jasper, I poured wine on you to make a point. The cheapest thing at that dinner was the wine. It was $42. That's not expensive. On a community center teaching salary, it is absolutely a capital investment. I laughed. And she did too, and the strangeness of the morning dissolved into something easier. She went back to her wheel, and I sat with the coffee, and eventually she said, without looking up, Come for dinner tonight, just us. I'll cook properly. We can call it whatever you want. A date, I said. She kept her eyes on the clay. Yes, a date. That night she made pasta, and I brought a bottle from the Okanagan, a red from Black Hills, that I'd been saving for something that merited it. We sat at her little table by the window, with the rain still going outside, because it was November in Vancouver, and the rain had entered its committed phase. She told me about a commission she'd been putting off, a set of ceremonial bowls for a client in North Van. I told her about the project I was actually excited about, a waterfront plan for a neighborhood that had been dismissed for years by people who hadn't understood it yet. She listened with both elbows on the table and her chin in her hands and said, "You sound like yourself when you talk about that." I paused. "What do I sound like the rest of the time?" "Like someone doing a credible impression of yourself," she said, "but less so." I looked at her across the small table. She held my gaze and didn't look away. I asked her halfway through the wine, "Why did you wait so long?" She turned her glass slowly. "Because you had rules. I could see them from the hallway, and I didn't want to be the thing you regretted because it violated the rules. They were reasonable rules." "They were afraid rules," she said, not unkindly. "The difference matters." My throat was tight. "I know," I said. She reached across the table and turned my hand over, her fingers resting in my palm. "What happened?" she asked. I told her. The coworker, the quiet ending, the 6 months of Tuesday meetings that felt like sitting through aftermath. She listened without filling the silence. "That's not this," she said when I finished. "I know." "Do you, actually?" I looked at her and said, "I know because I spent 11 months being careful, and it didn't make me feel less. It just made me cold." Imogen closed her fingers around mine. "Then let's be warm," she said, "and careful with each other. Those aren't the same thing." After dinner, we walked to Trout Lake and back, which was a longer walk than made practical sense in the November rain, but the kind of walk that makes sense when you've been wanting to be next to someone for almost a year and you're not ready to stop. She wore a bright yellow rain jacket. Without being asked, she pulled a spare toque from her coat pocket and handed it to me. I put it on. She looked at me wearing it and smiled at something she kept to herself. At the front door of our building, she stopped instead of going in. "What?" I said. She grabbed the front of my jacket and kissed me in the rain under the porch light, with no audience except the empty street, and she kissed me like someone who had been patient long enough and was finished with patience. I kissed her back on Fraser Street, and I stopped being careful about it. When we finally went inside, she took my hand in the hallway. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Not the kiss, though I would think about the kiss. The hand in the hallway, in the quiet ordinary building, with no one watching. Simple and certain even when there was no one to be certain for. We were halfway up the stairs when she said, quietly, for the record, "I'm glad I ruined your shirt." I squeezed her hand. "For the record," I said, "I'm starting to think it's my favorite shirt. The one currently in the bin. The one that started something that needed to start." She stopped on the landing, looked at me, and then she smiled the way she smiled when she was working, when the thing in her hands was finally becoming the thing she'd always meant to make. 4 months later, Devin arrived at my door on a Saturday with a bottle of burrowing owl Merlot and a card that read, "For the incident." Suki had told him. Of course Suki had told him. I framed the bottle label and put it on the wall beside the front door. Devin said this was unhinged. Imogen said it was romantic. I said it was accurate. We were all correct. By spring, she had moved her wheel upstairs. Not her whole apartment. Her apartment was hers and mine was mine, and we had learned, slowly and honestly, which mornings she needed quiet, and which mornings I needed to be alone with a problem before I was ready to talk about it. We had learned to say the thing before it became the wall. We had learned that choosing someone every day is not the same as choosing them once. I still left my door open a crack on the days I worked from home. She still knocked when she heard me go quiet on a call. One evening in June, I came home from a site visit in Burnaby, tired and behind on 3 reports and somehow lighter than I had felt in years. She was at my kitchen table, which had become the kind of normal that stops registering as remarkable, and she had made ramen from scratch because she had watched a video at 2 in the morning and gotten ambitious. She looked up. "Rough day?" "Productive," I said. "Just long." She nudged the bowl across the table. I sat down. She went back to what she was reading. In the window behind her, the light was doing the thing it does in Vancouver in June, staying late, generous with itself, filling the room with the particular warmth of a city that gets enough rain to know exactly what to do when the sun finally decides to show up. I looked at her and thought about the day she'd first knocked on my door with a broken shelf bracket and an opinion about labeling systems. About the toque she'd handed me without asking. About 11 months of deciding not to say something, And then one Friday night, when she poured wine and didn't apologize, and everything I had been holding in became something I could finally, carefully set down. Love didn't come with an announcement, in my experience. It came like the rain on this street, steadily, already there before you thought to check. It came in borrowed screwdrivers and remembered conversations and two people standing in a kitchen until one of them decided to stop pretending. It came in the holding on, and sometimes it came in the spilling. Have you ever had a moment like that? One that looked like an accident but changed everything? Tell us in the comments. And if this is the kind of story that keeps you company on a quiet night, subscribe and we'll see you next time on Whispered Someday.